Hey guys, I've been giving out advice on the internet for a long time in regards to barbecue. This year, I think I've seen more people cooking their first brisket than I've ever seen before. The problem with that is they're looking for advice on the single best way to cook a brisket. And it's impossible to answer that question. But I wanted to put together a video which basically shows you a foolproof method to cooking an amazing brisket. It's pretty straightforward, there's nothing complex to it. There's smoking, there's wrapping, there's resting, there's slicing. Hope you enjoy the video. Let me know if you have any questions. The first step, of course, is to start out with a whole brisket. This is Canadian AAA brisket. AAA being a pretty common grade of brisket that's available, but definitely something I'd recommend for your first brisket. AAA grading ensures that the meat is fairly high quality and has plenty of fat marbling through the meat. First step we're going to do is to get it out of this cryovac packaging. This vacuum sealed package is exactly how I prefer to start with my briskets. This is the packaging that comes right out of the meat packing plants in Alberta. As you can see, it's a fairly large chunk of meat. It's going to require some trimming, so we'll get in on it right now. This is a fairly large brisket. This one's looking at 16 to 18 pounds. I don't necessarily recommend cooking a huge one on your first try, but if you're feeding a crowd, you're definitely more than welcome to try that. I do recommend cooking a whole brisket, even if it's a smaller one at 10 to 12 pounds. So, step number one, we're going to get in here and we're going to trim off as much of this fat cap as we can. We're not going to trim it all. We'll come to that shortly here. A quick overview of the brisket as it sits here on the cutting board. Anatomy of a brisket, of course, is that it consists of two main muscles. First one, number one, is the flat muscle. It's generally pretty flat. It runs from here to here. You can see all the grains of the meat running in one direction. That's the flat muscle. The other muscle is the point muscle, and you can see that one down at the end here. It usually does come to a point. The point muscle, if I flip this brisket over, point muscle on this one runs right from here to about here. So obviously those two muscles overlap for the biggest part of the brisket, and overlapping muscles might be a bit of a challenge. The muscle structure, the fiber structure in each muscle is a little bit different, and there's a different amount of fat and collagen running through each muscle too. So we're not going to let that be a challenge for us. We're going to get in here and start trimming this right away. First thing I'll do is draw attention to this fat cap on top of the brisket. What we're going to do is we're going to trim about 50% of that, not 50%. We're going to trim most of that fat cap away. By most, I mean we're going to reduce it down to about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch. If you're talking metric, we're looking at 3 to 5 millimeters of fat remaining on the brisket by the time we're done. It certainly helps to have a really sharp knife to do this job. And if you're not familiar with trimming brisket, if you're not really familiar with brisket and you're not sure how deep to cut, I recommend just going with a little layer at once. So get in there. We're going to reduce this fat cap down to 1/4 inch, like I said. Just go a little bit at a time if you like, until we start to expose some of that meat underneath. I'd rather leave a little too much on than go too deep and expose a bunch of bare muscle. So that's it. If you're unsure, maybe give it a quick little nick there with your knife. You can see how deep that fat cap is. We want to make sure there's about 1/4 inch left on there. Carry on to the rest of the top of the brisket. Now we're getting over here to the right side. Hopefully that's the right side on camera. It's my left side. This is that point muscle again. It does contain a fair amount of fat and collagen and marbling. I'm a little less worried about leaving that 1/4 inch of fat cap on there. But we'll just take our time. We want a nice clean brisket by the time we're done. I'm going to trim off any jagged edges that are just going to burn. And we'll carry on. Looking pretty good here. This flat muscle is the leaner muscle of the two, so that's why it's a little more important to leave a little bit of fat on there. And this is just one technique again. I will emphasize there's no single best way to trim a brisket or to cook a brisket. My goal is to show you guys a method that's easy and a method that's virtually guaranteed to give you a good brisket your first time out. Okay, so that's about it for that side of the brisket. You'll notice this edge that's facing you. This one's pretty clean, but a lot of times there'll be a gray streak of what looks like overcooked meat along that edge of the brisket. And I will get in there and trim that off if I'm looking at that. This particular one doesn't seem to have that. But that's just a little bit of meat from the edge of the carcass as it's hanging, and they treat it to kill any bacteria that might be remaining on the surface. So that's about it for the top side of my brisket. Lift this up, show you guys what we're dealing with. Again, 1/4 to 1/2 inch 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch of fat cap left on that flat muscle, point muscle. We have a little bit of fat there, but I'm less worried about it. Flip that over. We have the bottom side of the brisket, the leaner side, the side where all the meat's exposed. My biggest issue here is getting rid of this extra fat that runs along the side. There's also a layer of fat that runs in between these two muscles. So I'm going to gradually trim that layer off. And I want to open up that fat seam that separates these two muscles. Let's get this done fairly quickly here. All this extra fat on the shoulder of the brisket, it's not adding anything to the cooking process. It's not going to render out during cooking, so we'll get rid of that now. And we'll start to pay attention to that area where those two muscles join in the middle. And there's that vein of fat that separates these two muscles. I'm going to trim that out for the most part. Every brisket looks a little bit different, but every whole packer brisket like this does have those two muscles, and there always is this vein of fat that runs through the middle. So we'll gradually trim that out. My goal here is not just to trim out the excess fat. My goal is to open up this point muscle. I want that point muscle exposed to the heat and to the smoke. It does contain a lot more fat and collagen running through it. And by opening up that point muscle, it means that point muscle is going to cook a little bit faster. By the time this brisket is done, I want both of these muscles to be tender. And this trimming technique is a good way to get there. So let's get in there. Okay, I'll show you in a second exactly what I'm talking about here. Once I flip this brisket around towards the camera, and see what we're dealing with. Now on the lean, flat portion of the brisket here, this patch of fat right in the middle, it's a little unusual. That usually isn't in there. I'm not too worried about it, but we'll get in there and remove that fat. I really want that bark to adhere to the meat really well. I want that bark forming on the meat. Sometimes you'll see some silver skin in here. We're not going to worry about that at all. And that's it. So I'll flip this around, show you what we're dealing with here now. You can see how I've removed that fat vein that separates those two muscles. This point muscle is opened up, exposed to the heat and the smoke. The point muscle is going to get fully cooked, fully tendered, fully rendered. That is our goal. Give you a quick close-up here. That's basically it. So we're done trimming. Next step is to season. Quick tip before I do that. It's important once we're done cooking this brisket that this flat muscle, both muscles actually, need to be carved against the grain. It's really easy to see what direction those fibers run in now, but by the time we're done cooking, it's not going to be so easy to see those fibers. So get this up here, you can see that the grain is running left to right on the camera. Grain runs along here. When I'm carving it, I want to be carving perpendicular to that grain. So just going to give myself a little notch on the end here. Sometimes if this end is narrow, I'll trim it right off. And this flat edge is my guide later on. I want to make sure my slices all run parallel to that flat edge. So one little trick. That's it for now. Time to season this thing. Now that we're ready to get our spice rub on here, we're going to start with a binder of some sort. The classic is a ballpark yellow mustard. There's other things you can use if you like. Feel free to get creative. The whole point of this process is to moisten the surface of the meat a bit, especially if you use something that has a little bit of texture like a mustard. And that will allow that spice rub to adhere a little bit better. The more spice rub we can get to adhere to the meat at this point, the better of a bark we're going to have in the end. So just a light little layer there. Can't actually taste the mustard in the end. We're going to hit this thing with a spice rub. Big beef rub to start. You can certainly use any commercial brisket rub or beef rub. Some people like to use some sort of a steak spice on their brisket. Or of course you can go with good old-fashioned salt and pepper, the Texas tradition. If you're going to use salt and pepper, be more generous with the seasoning than you think you need to be. Most of the more famous barbecue joints in Texas go with a mixture of 50% kosher salt, 50% cracked pepper. Second rub we have here is our tumbleweed all-purpose rub, so I'd like to just give it a little layer of each rub. That big beef rub won us the Canadian Barbecue Championship first place brisket within 6 months of us developing it. Since then we have found that judges prefer a little more sweetness in their brisket slice, whether they realize it or not. So we blend the two spice rubs. Okay, we're gonna get in here, make sure every surface is coated with a heavy dose of spice rub. Again, it's quite important that we get a lot of spice rub on here now, because this thing's gonna be on the smoker for 12 to 14 hours. And we want to ensure that that flavor stays on there and adheres to the meat and helps us develop that bark. So that's it, heavy coat of spice rub. I'll let this sit on here for 5 or 10 minutes. The smoker's preheating, obviously. If this spice rub adheres here for 10 or 15 minutes, the salt will start to draw some moisture up out of the meat. This dry powder will turn into more of a paste. And we introduce this piece of meat to the smoker. It's got some moisture on the surface. That's going to draw in the smoke. It's going to help develop a smoke ring. So again, 15 minutes before the meat goes on the smoker. You can apply it the day before if you want, but it won't make a big difference in the end result. Let's go to the smoker. It's time to smoke that brisket. That 12 to 14 pound brisket that we started out with is going to take 12 to 14 hours to cook, maybe up to 15 hours. We're cooking on a pellet smoker tonight, but you could just as easily use a charcoal smoker. Pellet grills tend to run a little faster just because there's active airflow. You get more of a convective cooking environment. But we're planning 12, 14, maybe up to 15 hours for that brisket to get tender. You may get lucky with a 14 pound brisket and have it take 12 hours. You may start out with a lighter brisket and have it take 14 or 15 hours. There's just no accurate way to predict it. But we're gonna cruise at 250 all night. We're gonna plug in our FYoder probe on this FYoder smoker, and we're gonna monitor the internal temperature through the cooking process. More or less just so I can show you the stall that's gonna happen at some point. Again, 250 degrees, as long as your smoker can run a stable temperature for a long time. That's a good magic number. We're gonna get this brisket tender. So let's get that meat on the grill. Time to go. I'm actually cooking 2 briskets here tonight. I'm gonna put the smaller one on top. I'm gonna put the larger brisket on the bottom. And this is the fat cap side of the brisket. We're gonna keep that down. One of the reasons we left that layer of fat on there is we're gonna use that fat as an insulating layer to protect it a little bit from that direct radiant heat that's coming off that steel plate on the bottom of our pellet grill. That's it. Close the lid. I'm not going to open this lid until another 8 or 9 hours down the road. At that point, we're going to check it and test and see whether it's ready to wrap in foil. Good night, brisket. One last detail. As you can see, if you want to run a probe inside your meat, we're going to stick that probe in the thickest part of the brisket. That probe in this case is connected to our controller, but it could just as easily be connected to a handheld unit. That's going to allow us to monitor that internal temperature through the cooking process. This is not a mandatory step, but it's a step we're going to do today just so we can show you what the cook looks like over a long period of time. Okay, it's morning. The sun is way up. We're going to peek at that brisket. So this is what I'm looking for. I'm ready to wrap this brisket. It has plenty of bark on it, plenty of smoke flavor already. Show you the one on the upper rack. That's what I'm looking for. That bark is really well developed. It's not going to wash off in the foil. Let's do it. Okay, that brisket's ready to wrap. We've got it down on the aluminum foil here. I like to put it at a bit of an angle here to make sure we can get good coverage with the foil. And I'm just going to start make a little boat here, because we're going to add about a cup of beef broth at this point. You can add any other liquids you might think complement the flavor of beef, but we're going to make this one an easy one. And we're going to continue to wrap it up. I'm just watching for any sharp edges of the brisket that might be still there from shriveling up on the cooker. If I see those, I'll just clip them off quickly so they don't puncture through the foil. Quite important that we don't get any holes in this foil after it's wrapped. Okay, that's wrap number 1. Because this is quite a big brisket, it's going to take me a couple layers to make sure it's 100% enclosed. There we go. One tight little boat. Point muscle down here, flat muscles overlapping it. My probe is going to go back in there. We're going to watch for 195, and that just means the brisket is getting sort of close. Okay, the brisket's off the smoker. The probe I left in there is showing 195, 196, which just tells me the brisket is relatively close to being done. I don't know if that's an accurate temperature or not. We're going to get in here and open this brisket up and see what we find. So, remember there was a couple of sheets of foil, so we're going to be careful in how we dismantle this thing. You don't want to lose all that precious liquid that's still in here. So we'll open this thing up. As you can see, the point muscle's facing you right now and the flat muscle's a little further down. We're just going to get in here with our probe on the thickest part of the brisket. You see how easily that probe is sliding in there? That's exactly what I want. So we're showing 190. I actually did this exact same thing about 5 minutes ago and it was showing 200. So if you care about the temperature, it hit 202. I don't care about the temperature. I'm just looking for that probe as it goes in there. If you're looking for recommendations on a probe, this is a Lava Tools thermometer, available on Amazon.ca. It's high quality, accurate, quick, and it's inexpensive as well. So we're gonna pack this brisket away and let this rest for a few hours until I'm ready to slice it. So I've just got an old beach towel here. We'll wrap this thing up. This will help insulate that meat and allow it to rest and relax. We're gonna leave this bundle in a small cooler, maybe the microwave oven, until we're ready to carve into it. So, see you in a bit. This is the part we've been waiting for. All that time, all that smoke, all that effort. This brisket has been resting ideally now for a couple of hours. We've got an old towel here. Time to pull that package out, tear into it. So I'll open this foil up. I'm gonna be really careful here because I don't want to lose all that amazing juice inside the package here. That beef broth we added has picked up all the flavor from this brisket. All the bark flavor, the smoke flavor, the spice flavor. So while we gently pull that brisket out, we're going to be careful to save that juice that's still in the package. So I'll just pour that off and see how dark that is, see how much flavor that's picked up. Let's put that aside. Time to slice that brisket. All right, so let's get in here. I'm gonna get right in here and separate these two muscles along that fat vein that divides them. Clearly like a hot knife through butter. That is so easy. Flat muscle, point muscle. If you want to, let's do it today. Because of the way we trim this point muscle, it's really tender now, really well rendered, right? You can see it right there. Very tender. We're just gonna cut this up into cubes. This would be referred to as burn ends. Burn ends are always cut from the point muscle of a brisket, but depending on which Kansas City restaurant you visit, their interpretation is all a little bit different. But a lot of the ones that have opened in the last 10 years, especially with a competition background, they're gonna serve you burn ends that are exactly what you see right here. Really tender, really well rendered point muscle. Just cut that up into nice little cubes. Throw those in our pan. And we'll turn our attention back to the flat muscle. I like to make sure we carve this flat muscle last. I want everybody to be sitting at the kitchen table waiting for it because this is the leaner of the two muscles. As soon as we're done carving it, as soon as we start carving it, it starts to lose some moisture. So as you can see, I'm just removing some of that excess fat from the seam that runs between those two muscles. That's an optional step, but I've found that our guests prefer to eat the meat with a little bit of fat left to it. Remember on brisket that grain's always running in one direction. So if you can't tell right now by looking at it, flip it over until you get to the meat side where we've separated those two muscles. You just scrape that membrane back a little bit, and I can see that the grain is running in this direction right here. So we're carving at a 90-degree angle to that grain. Okay, that's what we're left with. So as we get through this brisket here, the slices approximately pencil thick is the guideline. We can stop, we can evaluate tenderness at that point. You may have seen over and over again on the internet that finger drape test. Competition judge will actually pull that brisket slice apart. They want to see it separate with very little resistance. And finally, quick little attention grab to the smoke ring on there. I've read over and over on the internet that you can't get a great smoke ring with a pellet grill. I think we can prove that wrong pretty easily here. And that's it. Nice sharp knife. Keep our slices nice and close together so we don't lose moisture. Just keep on slicing. If your bark starts to separate on top here a little bit, not the end of the world. One end of the brisket to the other. The other thing I like to do is move that whole brisket into the pan. That whole brisket flat stays together. Get our extra slices in here on the end. That's it, guys. Completely sliced brisket. Nice and tender. And remember all that juice we saved from the foil? We gotta include that. Absolutely. That's it. Sliced brisket, start to finish. Please let me know if you have any questions. Hope you enjoyed the video. Cheers.